Today we will do the text of the 21st chapter. We explained what the 21st chapter, the message of the 21st chapter over the 20th chapter in length in the last class, namely, which you can find on koshertube.com or with the text on tanyaonline.com. So we won't elaborate on this, but just in brief, basically the Alter Rebbe is saying in this 21st chapter that from the 20th chapter, the message is of the insignificance, how small or how little one letter is in comparison to the bigger picture, the amount of speech, of the amount of letters a person pronounced in his lifetime, or the potential, how much he can speak, and even deeper within the soul in comparison to all the machshavas, ICAs and machshava, which not only are so much greater numbers, letters of thought, not only are so much greater numbers, but the quality of these otiyot, the quality of these letters are way superior than the quality letters of dibur. And as we get deeper into the nefesh, the atiyot don't even exist within midot or chachma bina das, the intellectual faculties within man. And again, we deal with that ot, which Hashem created the entire world. Ki biko Hashem tzurei lamim, as it says, biyud nivra olam haba, the world to come was created with a yud, and this world was created with a hey. So one again, the whole Asara Mamoris are the expressions. The Hey is the oxygen, the only letter rather, the source. Let's put it this way. The source of all letters is associated with Hey, which demonstrates the source of all the letters, the formation of all letters. The Hey is like the oxygen, the pump of oxygen, which ultimately enters or forms these 22 letters, or the 21 letters in the Aleph base. So eventually from this Hey, there's the Asara Mamoris, the 10 sayings which Hashem created the world with. Asara Mamoris Nivra Ha'olam. But the Hey is Tzurei Lamim. Biyud Biko Hashem Tzurei Lamim. The Olam is the core energy of Olam, comes from the Hey, this world, and again the Yud, Olam Haba, as the Chazal tell us, that our sages tell us and translate this pasuk, Biko Hashem Tzurei Lamim. So the message is how insignificant one ot is in comparison to the bigger picture. Again, Isis Hadibur, Isis Machshava, and deeper within the Nefesh, where the Atiyot don't even exist. And naturally, this is all an example, the way it is by man, and how much more so when you're dealing with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So again, this is very brief, but you could find it with clear understanding in the previous classes. The advantage of the 21st chapter over that is not only how insignificant it is, or how small it is, kind of as almost a non-existent entity, but how it's truly, even when it is still not, which means like this. When we said, we gave an example, which will give us a little to understand what the message is. The one drop of the Mediterranean, what is it in comparison to all the waters in the Mediterranean? Almost nothing. Literally almost nothing. Take that 1 teaspoon in comparison to all the waters in the Mediterranean, it's almost nothing. Again, the message in the 20th chapter. But ultimately, that teaspoon you cannot say it's completely a non-existent entity, for there is a bit of water in that teaspoon. So truly, in comparison to the entire waters in the Mediterranean, obviously that it's completely insignificant, and truly almost nothing is nothing at all. But could you say it's truly nothing? No, you can see this is tangible. This is a bit of water, and the quality of the water is similar to the quality of all the waters in the Mediterranean. Comes the Alter Rebbe, and similar to when we say one letter, as the Alter Rebbe uses the metaphor the way it is, the example the way it is by man, is truly insignificant in comparison to all the letters one has spoken or what can speak in comparison to the Otiyot HaMachshava, the letters the way they stand with superior quality in the world of thought, with superior quality in the world of thought, or in comparison to the deeper dimensions of the soul where letters don't even exist. True, but ultimately that little one word or one letter which the person pronounces, you can say it's not. In comparison to the bigger picture, it's certainly almost nullified, but it still is. So how could we say, getting back to which we say in davening, and as it says Like it says, that just like Hashem, you are the only one before creation, and now you are the only one even there is a creation, and the emphasis is this. It's the same meaning to say that just like before Hashem created the world, it was only Hashem. After Hashem creates the world, apparently there is not only Hashem, there is a world as minute as you want to place it in the face of Hashem, but ultimately it is. So there's ultimately two entities, Hashem, the greater picture, but something very small little crumb, which is Eilam, which is truly nullified in the presence of Hashem. But it ultimately is, just like when you say the us, the letter, when a person utters that letter, he pronounces that letter, it still is. So it's not the same. Hashem, after Hashem created the world, there's two entities. One a very small entity in almost nothing, as no thing, but yet it still is. So after Hashem created the world, there is a Eilam, and Hashem is not only overcharged, overwhelmingly present in this face of the Eilam. Again, the message of Peri Chafal, but it's Chaf, but it still is, apparently. So you can't say it's the same Kedim Shnivra Eilam before Hashem created the world and after Hashem created the world, because apparently it's not. Before the Hashem created it was nothing. There was no world at all. There was only Hashem. After Hashem creates the world, you can't say that it's exactly the same. Apparently. Comes down to that in Perek Chaf and says, this metaphor what I gave you, of the insignificance of one ot, of one letter, in comparison to the nefesh of man, again with all the different levels, they see Sadibur, Machshava, and Midot, and Chachma Bina Das, again like we elaborated in the past, and we're touching upon this again, this example today, is only, but ultimately again, the message that it still is, right? It still is that letter of Ut, that one letter still exists, that only exists by man, not by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the message, again, as we mentioned in the previous classes, that by man, once you say a word, it leaves you. So it's not, there's two dimensions of speech. One, that it reveals of something which goes on within you. In other words, a person speaks what he thinks. That's one dimension of speech. Another dimension of speech, that it becomes a separate entity. And as we mentioned, we elaborated in the previous class, that many people have problems of this which they say. It's written in history, and people take it because they can't put it back within the system. It should swallow itself in within the system. It cannot happen once you utter that word. It separated itself from you, so it is as small as it is and minute as it is, yet it's a separate entity from you, and therefore people take it and write about it and so on and so forth. When it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that whole idea that something left HaKadosh Baruch Hu became a separate entity does not exist. Because as we said before, that we explained last week, when it comes to man, he is in one position, and when he speaks, it leaves him. As opposed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even when Hashem speaks, you can say that Hashem is here, and that's where it stops, and then there's speech which became separate from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which again creates a world. We know that there's no place which is devoid of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So ultimately, HaKadosh Baruch Hu becomes Maloi Kol Haaretz K'Vaydei, that Hashem is everywhere, and if Hashem is everywhere, He is ultimately in the place where that speech is. So you can't say it became a separate entity and therefore it exists. No. Hashem is, even after He spoke, He still is in the place where that speech is. Take, for example, take that letter. If it could have been a possibility to go back it up and put it back into the system within man, it would be completely not only nullified in comparison to the bigger picture, it would really turn back to a state of not. The problem is we can't do that. Once a letter left us, it really remains out there. But theoretically, if you want to understand this, take that letter, that letter, in this time before I spoke it, or let's say after I spoke it, if I could put it back into the system, it really becomes to a state of non-existence. Because when does it exist as a structured letter? When I uttered that letter, when I verbally said that letter, expressed myself with that letter. But prior to that, the way when it was in the koach, the potential state of speech, or deeper in the potential, in the oisis hamachshava, when it was again part of my thought process, or deeper yet within my feelings, which atiyot don't even exist, or even deeper within the soul where you're dealing with the intellectual faculties, Chachma Bina Das with Otiyot certainly don't exist, that Ot is completely gone. Gone means it's not there. You're talking prior to the manifestation of that Ot, or let's say theoretically, which does not exist by man, theoretically they could put it all the way back into the system. It'll come to a state of completely nothingness. True nothingness, not only in comparison to this soul. And by HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that even after he says it, even he spoke creation into being, nonetheless Hashem, which is everywhere, there's no stop and say, this is where Hashem stops and that's where his speech kicks in. Or his speech, that letter becomes separate. There's no place which is devoid of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, hence there's no place which is separate from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem is in the place where he speaks. So it's similar to that Ot, think about it in the metaphor of man, similar to that letter, the way it goes back into the system. It goes back within the system, then it becomes not only in comparison to the bigger picture, the nothingness of that Ot, but more so, it truly becomes a state of not. And that's why Atu, even after Hashem created the world, Hashem is Malaikal Ha'aretz K'meidah. The whole core of Hashem is in the place where he speaks, and therefore Atu Hashem is there just like when he was created. Before he created the world, it was only Hashem. Now after Hashem created the world, there's still only Hashem. We gave an example just to get a little bit, again, it's not a clear example because ultimately you're dealing with something physical and it's still always there. But just to understand it, take that teaspoon, for example, prior to you pulled out that teaspoon. Or better yet, take that teaspoon, throw back into the Mediterranean. Could you find that teaspoon again? That particular water, could you find? You can't find it. It's gone. But the only thing is, it's not truly gone. We can identify it. We cannot locate it. But just gives us the example that when that teaspoon is back in the Mediterranean, so then you can identify it. It's kind of non-existent as a teaspoon. Again, the same teaspoon, the way it was before, as the way it is right now. But again, it's just more that we cannot identify it. It's dispersed in so many different areas within the Mediterranean. It's impossible to put it back in its original structure, but just gives us the idea. And also the Mediterranean has an end as well, as a beginning as an end, as large as it is. But the saying this idea or conveying this message or this type of examples just to give us an understanding. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even after he speaks, he is in the place where he speaks. The speech is within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because you cannot say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu stops and there begins the notion of that, the Dibur, the notion of Dibur of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the only similarity between Hashem's speech and our speech is just the idea that Hashem reveals within creation. He revealed this is what he had in his thought, but not Chas v'Shalom that it became a separate entity or an entity on its own. It's as if the same Ot goes back into the system by man, and then it becomes to a state of complete nothingness. So let's just see it inside. That the Midah of HaKadosh, the beginning of chapter 21, right? It is in the beginning of the that first page of the text. So he Midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shleik Midas Basar B'Adam. The first page of the text in English, with the Hebrew and the English translation. So that the midah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not like the midah the way it is by man of flesh and blood. When man speaks, the speech, namely the oxygen, when you could even feel it physically if you put your hand next to the mouth of someone speaking. So it's not only the information becomes like something tangible, people pick it up and can make a fuss about it. In other words, I use the expression making a fuss about it, which you can understand in media, for example. They pick up on a word, it's there, they're holding on to it, you can't put it back to its original state. But more so, the Alter Rebbe says physically there's the oxygen which emerges from one's mouth when he speaks. Humurgosh, it's spelled it appears like something on its own. So media means to say that today you see how something like the one word, you can't, what people would wish they would be able to put it back into the system, but they can't, because it left the person. But more, the Alter Rebbe puts it over here that you'd feel it also, the oxygen becomes something tangible and palpable. And it moved on misharsher. Once it's spoken, it's separated from its source. The source remains here, where the man is, and this becomes separated from its source. What is the source? The 10 dimensions of the soul itself. which is the Midas and the Chacham Bina Das. The Alter Rebbe mentions this, namely where Otiyot doesn't exist, as we elaborated in the previous chapter. When it comes to Hashem, His speech is not separated from Him. Even after He speaks, and ultimately speaks creation into being, that speech remains part and parcel of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because ain't davar chutz mimenu. There's nothing else out of the domain of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. To say that this is where He stops and that's where His speech emerged from His system. There is no place which is devoid of Hashem, unless asar panim minei. There's no domain which is empty and devoid of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That Hashem's speech is not like our speech. Chas v'shalom, heaven forsake us, or Chas v'shalom is an expression of the Chas means mercy. May God have mercy on us. When we say the term Chas v'shalom is when something is completely out of something which is completely out of the truth, or something which is not comfortable. In this case, it's also, this term is Chas v'shalom is said because it's so ludicrous. This idea to equate Hashem's dibur ki dibureinu, because you're dealing with God, Creator, and dealing with creation. That's Chas v'shalom. And where do we see it? Like Hashem's thought is not like our thought. Like it says clearly, explicitly in the verse, that my thought is not like your thoughts. And similarly, Hashem's speech is not like our speech. Uksivin, it says, my ways are so much loftier than your ways. There's no comparison to speech of man to the speech of God. The only reason why Hashem uses the term dibur, starting from the Aseres HaMamores, the 10 sayings Hashem brought creation into being, and ultimately later that said as Hadibris is an example, which were the deeper part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu expressed His speech within a deeper dimension, which has become the Aseres Hadibris, which is the source of the entire Torah. So he says the whole reason why it's called Dibur b'shem Dibur HaKadosh Mashal, it's similar just like the speech of man, that he reveals to the listeners this which was hidden and concealed in his thoughts. That is the notion of speech. If you want to classify speech, this is the ability of man to express this which is concealed in his thought. He has the ability to bring it to a state of revelation and manifestation. That's where the similarity of Dibur of HaKadosh Baruch Hu with man. When he deals with the infinite, and dealing with the infinite of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the emerging of the light and the vitality from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from a state from a state of concealment to a state of revelation, to create worlds and to vitalize them, to vivify them. That's where it's called B'Shem Dibur. And that's the Pirush of Asara Mamaris Nivra Olam, or Aseres Hadibris, starting from Asara Mamaris Shebed Nivra Olam, that before they were not, because again they were a state of Helen, they were a state of in a concealed manner, and Hashem brought them into a state of revelation. Again, the idea of speech, that's why it's called Ma'amores. And then the deeper dimension of Hashem's Dibur, which we call Aseres Hadibris, which Hashem revealed, which was true, which was deeper, so truly Tzaf V'Nelam, believed by which was concealed in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's mind, which is ultimately part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is the Aseres Hadibris, as we mentioned a number of times. One called Mamoris, one called Dibris, which Mamoris are the inferior expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which creates an inferior world, or a world without Torah mitzvahs, remain inferior, have no meaning, have no purpose, as opposed to Aseres Hadibris, which is also Dibur. This is the inner core of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the purpose of all creation, and so on and so forth. This is as is brought down, the Mamoris are called Milin de Hedyaita, this simple words as opposed to the deeper, meaningful words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which came across Torah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealing the Torah primarily with Aseres Hadibres. These are all this again was as well similar to the idea of Dibur or Aseres Hadibres, because this again has that dimension that it reveals this which is hidden. And so it says Shaykal Torah, the revelation which came through the Nevi'im, through the prophets, and again as it becomes one of the compartments of Torah, and Ksuvim, which is we know the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, Shisigu, Nevi'im, Amar Nebasim, which the prophets perceived with a vision of their prophecy. So this is the only similarity when we want to think about the idea of dibur, the similarity to man. If you could use the word similarity to man, but the reason why again the dibur Hashem. He said there's the asar mamaris or aseres hadibris is where the notion of speech is ultimately a faculty which brings this which was concealed in my thought into a state of revelation. That is where the asar mamaris and the aseres hadibris have in common kaviyachol with the speech la'avdul of man. But when it comes to the separation of speech, there's no similarity at all. When it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's speech and it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's thought, even after they come to a state of expression, they still always miyuchadisim. Like again, we elaborated last week in the beginning of this class, they always remain together with Him with the ultimate unity. It doesn't become a separate entity because Hashem is in the place where He spoke. The derech mashal is similar. Again, we alluded to this and we noted this in the beginning of this week's class and elaborated much in the last week's class. Just like the speech and thought of man, when they're in the state of chachma and seichel, when they're in the state, they're still in the state of the intellectual faculties of man, which is as chachma bin das. As we mentioned, there the otiyot don't even exist. You take that speech which was ultimately uttered as it came down, evolved from intellect into feelings. Again, that's how the process of man, till he's able to speak, till he utters the expression of speech is ultimately a koach, a energy which evolves from the deeper parts of man, from his intellect, via his feelings, via his thought, and ultimately comes to an expression of speech. So take that same ot, that same letter, and trace it back to where it came from, where it's in the state of chachma v'seichel, there is no atiyot, or even b'tshukah v'chem d'shebelivim, when it's a state of a feeling or a desire in his heart, there is no atiyot. Kodem sh'ol samei alev l'meichel arba, before it ascended from the heart to the mind, to the machshava, where there is the initial state of formation of letters, prior to its coming from the heart to the machshava, to speak, to think rather, where there is already the beginning, the initial state of structured letters, and eventually it becomes more concrete letters when it comes into the world of speech. But before that, when it was still in its original state, where were those letters? Were they something and nullified to a bigger picture, or they were completely not? The answer, they were completely not in their original stage. Then these letters of thought, or these letters of speech, which came from the desire of the man's heart, when they were in the potential state in the heart, and then they were complete in the state of natum. They were completely one b'sharshan in their source, which is again maybe feelings or chachma v'seichel, or deeper within their source, which is in the intellectual faculty, where everything initiates there, shebemayach, within the brain of man. And again, it comes into chemda tshuka shebelev, into the yearning or into the desire of man, which that's the way that it evolves. Someone understands something intellectually, then he has a drive to it, which he develops a feeling in his heart, and then it travels into, it becomes a structured thought. That's where again the formation, the initial place where there is the formation of letters, where letters form themselves, and then they become concrete letters in speech. The person utters those words which he spoke. But take that same word and put it in the place where it originated from. It's not something very small. It is in a state of complete nothingness, as no thing at all. As we mentioned, there is no atheist. So when it comes to man, so then that's how it is prior to him speaking, pronouncing that word. But once he pronounces the word, you cannot put it back into the system. It truly becomes separate. When it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we're going to continue Be'ez Hashem in the following class, the culmination of this message. When it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even after he speaks creation into being, that same speech always remains within the most deepest core parts of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because these deep core parts of HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not go anywhere. Lesasar Poni Mine, the whole Eibishter, the way he is, B'chvayde v'atzmei, with his inner core and his inner essence, it remains in the place where that speech has been pronounced and ultimately thus created a world. So every part of Olam, which is a part of the creation, or pride of the expression of Hashem's Dibur, and that is ultimately overwhelmed by the core essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where Otiyot don't exist. Hence, that Dibur which created Elamis is ultimately always in a state of nothing is no thing. And that is the pirush, that even Ato, even Hashem, you created the world, is still only Ato. It is only you, not only something which is very minute and small and tiny in comparison to you, but still is. But there is only you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Have a great night.